Ladies and gentlemen, I am back once again. Last week, this time, Zack Snyder's director's cuts of Rebel Moon Part 1 and Part 2 released on Netflix. Part 1 being Chalice of Blood and Part 2 The Scargiver. And I finally got a chance to view both of them this week. And in this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts. Now, director Zack Snyder initially pitched Rebel Moon to Disney back when they first bought Lucasfilm. It's his version of Star Wars, and Disney, of course, now owns Star Wars, which, for better or worse, is a good or bad thing depending on who you ask. But initially he pitched this to Disney when they bought Lucasfilm. That didn't pan out, and here we are with it being on Netflix. It first premiered on Netflix last year, Part 1 and Part 2, and then Zack announced that there would be director's cuts of both movies, and we finally got to see them last week when it debuted on Netflix, both Part 1 and Part 2. And even though you see a lot of influence of things like Star Wars, you definitely see a little bit of Dune. And even for me, I saw some glimpses of Game of Thrones. I don't know whether that was intentional or not. This is still very much through and through a Zack Snyder project. And the director's cuts, to me, flow Part 1 and Part 2, the director's cuts, they flow very, very well into each other. Now, did I have some problems? Yeah, I did. But for the most part, overall, I still really had an enjoyable experience with both movies. I particularly like Part 2, The Scargiver, a little bit more, but that's just me. But I did like Part 1 as well, but I like Part 2 just a little bit more. The movie is called Rebel Moon, and Sofia Boutella's Cora is indeed a rebel, and she shines in the movie in both Part 1 and Part 2 to me. You know, during her crusades as being a rebel, she's known as Cora, but during her crusades as being a participant of war, she's known as Arthelaus. Arthelaus is actually a name of a woman in Catholicism, for those that want to do a little research, because I thought that name was really cool, and I did a little research on that, so I thought that was really cool. And I really liked how they showed that she had some training prior to her just, you know, throwing down and kicking ass and shooting guns and all that. I really appreciated that aspect as well. Her supporting cast is pretty good as well. Of course, with it being an R-rated film, not everybody makes it, but I really like the supporting cast. He got some really big names for this movie. You know, Charlie Hunnam, for those that watched Sons of Anarchy or liked King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, like I did. Djimon Hounsou as well, who's also a fantastic actor for those that have seen Blood Diamond. And Zack Snyder also reteamed with Ray Fisher. He plays Darian Bloodaxe in the movie, one of the primary leaders of the Bloodaxes in the film. And of course, every good film needs a villain, and this guy that everyone casts as the bad guy that is just a little too good at playing villains in movies, Ed Skrein plays the villain Noble in both Part 1 and Part 2. And to me, I think for the most part, everyone in the supporting cast did a terrific job. My favorite characters in Rebel Moon Part 1 and Part 2 were Nemesis and, of course, General Titus. I like Djimon Hounsou, and I think he did a really good job playing General Titus in this. In terms of world building and in terms of storytelling, like they did with the Army of the Dead movie that Zack Snyder also directed for Netflix, Netflix gave Zack a big budget for both of these movies. And in Part 1, when you have bad guys like a Noble, you definitely see why there needs to be a rebellion. And of course, in Part 2, you get some more backstory as well. In Part 2, the director's cuts, that is, of course, that's what we're talking about still. You do get more backstory still, but you also finally get to see them all throw down in those movies as well. And it also hints at more to come, and there's still more unanswered questions that I feel would be left served in a third part of Rebel Moon, should there be a third part. In regards to world building in Rebel Moon Part 1 and Part 2, I was personally a little surprised given the budget and given how massive the story itself is, that we didn't see a whole lot of off-world stuff in either one of the movies thus far. Now, should there again be a Part 3? Should there be a Part 3? I'm sure that will likely change, given how big the story could definitely go. But I was a little surprised that we didn't see any off-world stuff in the movie, because you can definitely see the Star Wars influence, and I'm sure going into the movie, a lot of people might have been expecting that as well. But even with that definitely doesn't take away from either one of the movies, even with me preferring Part 2 to Part 1. This is very much still a story about a woman who chooses to stand up and fight and has people behind her who are willing to fight alongside her as well. It's called Rebel Moon again. It's R rated. Again, the director's cuts are R rated. Obviously, everybody ain't gonna make it, but still, that again doesn't take away from either one of the movies, for me at least. I like Zach, love his move, a lot of his movies. Um, I was not a big fan of Gunner. Gunner is Cora's love interest in the movie. I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of Gunner in this. However, that again doesn't necessarily take away from the movie because overall, I like I said, the director's cuts of the movies just flow a lot better than the original cuts that we saw last year did. And there's some imagery in the movie that's really subtle, but also very powerful for me, at least as well. And I definitely caught some of it right away. Some of it I had to go back and watch when I do a rewatch of both movies. But that for me was an enjoyable aspect that I saw in both films. Like one of his earlier movies, Sucker Punch, Rebel Moon once again shows that Zack Snyder is very comfortable and very cool with having a female being the lead and the center of the movie. And this is why I never understood that whole criticism that Zack Snyder apparently hates women when all of his movies have strong female characters in them. And oh yeah, I didn't mention him earlier, but of course, Anthony Hopkins does play Jimmy in this, the robot as well. And even though we don't see a whole lot of him in either one of the movies, I still really enjoyed all of his scenes as well. All in all, ladies and gentlemen, Chapter 1, Chalice of Blood, and Chapter 2, Curse of Forgiveness, I feel that as director's cuts, again, they flow really well. Sophia Boutella was really good as the lead, Cora or Arthur whoever you choose to call her. And I'm really interested to see where Zach decides to go next with this, should Netflix decide to greenlight a part three, because there's so much more world building that they could definitely do, so many other different themes that they could tackle, and so many other things that could be brought into this universe should there be more Rebel Moon. And it seems like there would be. I'm not really sure how the director's cuts are doing in terms of views for Netflix, but Zach is really popular in Netflix. He's got another project I'm really excited to see called Twilight of the Gods, which will premiere next month, and that's going to be really interesting as well. But again, going back to Rebel Moon Part 1 and Part 2, the director's cuts, I definitely think you should give them a watch and definitely will enjoy them if you watch them front to back, start to finish. Because no matter what a Rotten Tomato critic has to say, no matter what somebody on Twitter has to say, it's been proven time and time again. Shout out to the Release the Snyder Cut fandom. It's been proven time and time again. Zack Snyder's director's cuts always are the better versions of his movies. And this is another prime example, in my opinion.